Today's reading comes from the 15th chapter of John. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask him in my name. I am giving you these commands so that you may love one another.
Will you pray with me? God, may the words professed here in this space be seeds of peace and hope and love in our hearts. Amen. When I was in middle school, way back in the 1980s, one Sunday morning, my parents told my brother and I that I was going to go to church with my mom, and my brother was going to stay home with my dad. Now, this was very, very unusual behavior. With very few exceptions, we went to church as a family every Sunday. We would have never split up. And if we would have, it certainly would have been discussed before that morning. So I got in the car with my mom, not really knowing what was happening. And she started to have a serious conversation with me. So when I grew up, I had a foster brother who was about 18 years older than me. So he was a working adult at this point. And my mom told me that some people at his work had been cruel to him. They were calling him names and bullying him. She told me he was gay. Now again, this is like 1985, 86, somewhere in there. She also went on to tell me that there was absolutely nothing wrong with him. And this was how God made him, that he loved who he loved, and that we loved him. And that was the end of the story. She was telling me, my dad was telling my brother, and they wanted us to hear it now because they were sure that when we went to school, we would hear belittling conversations, possibly even slurs, and we were to never join in with these conversations or use these words anywhere else, especially at our house. Even if they sounded harmless, they were not. We pulled into church. I remember sitting at church and my head was spinning. I was Catholic, I grew up Catholic, so there was a lot of ritual and silence in the church, much more than we have here in the United Church of Christ. So I had some time with my thoughts. And at some point, I can clearly, even today, remember hearing a voice, maybe an inspiration, definitely something holy. And it said something like, Heather, this is the same person you've known all your life. There's nothing different about him right now than there was yesterday. It's you that are changing. You loved him before, why wouldn't you love him now? On the car ride to church, I was unsettled. On the ride home, I had peace. And that peace has remained with me throughout my life. I didn't have the words to describe what it was yet, but I feel like I started to become an ally. In high school, I even went with my foster brother to join in some protests at the Topeka Capitol building. But looking back at that, the real allies in this story are my parents. Now, I was definitely raised in a house where people from all backgrounds would have been accepted and welcomed, but my parents were not radicals. They were two adults raising children in Kansas. They both grew up on small, poor farms. My mom grew up on a farm up near the Nebraska border. My dad on a farm in the South in Maryland. We lived in a working class neighborhood. My parents are both very religious. I love that they decided that taking me to church was the right course of action for this conversation. Why wouldn't you tell your middle school age daughter about her gay foster brother and then just plop her down in a pew? Isn't that what all parents from Kansas in the 1980s did? So, several years later, I left the Catholic Church for many reasons, but one of the main reasons I became a pastor in the United Church of Christ is because of their bold and historic witness for LGBTQ plus justice and inclusion. I wanted to be in a church that celebrated all people as beloved children of God. I wanted to be in a church that celebrated Pride Month like we are doing here at Colonial, because it is such important and life-saving work in the world. It's the work of spreading God's love. This morning, we read about God's love from the 15th chapter in the Gospel of John. And we hear what I consider a sermon from Jesus on the topic of love. He says, "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love." Now, certainly, we need to hear the call to love in this sermon. And Jesus goes on to tell us that we get God's love and then we need to spread it to others, and that this love will bring us joy, and it should be the most important thing in our life. But the word that really jumped out at me was the word abide. Abide in my love, Jesus says. Abide. It's related to the word abode, right? A word that connotes the idea of home, a place of comfort, something enduring. Abide in my love, Jesus invites us. Come make a home with me. Come, make a lasting relationship. You don't need to put on airs or be someone you're not. Abide with me. Be at home here with me. Abide in my love. There's a subgenre of fiction that's become popular recently called cozy fiction. Have you heard of cozy fiction? I see some smiles on some faces. It's this fiction that you want to read. They sort of want to curl up and read because you want to be soothed. Sometimes there's even a subgenre of like murder mystery cozy fiction. I always think that's sort of a oxymoron. Like you want to be soothed, but there's a murder. It's like all the British murder mysteries on Sunday night on PBS. Cozy fiction is like sipping a cup of tea. The stories focus on community and creating a place of belonging that you'd certainly like to join because the people there are friends and everyone is accepted. And usually there's a healing that is happening in the inner world of the characters. That's what I feel like when I read this Bible passage. Abide in my love. It's like the cozy lit of the Bible. Abide in me, Jesus says. Come as you are. Be soothed. Make a home. Everyone's going to be friends. Heal. Be in community. Find true friends and know that there is no end to my love. It's a nice vision, isn't it? One of my callings, as I've worked as a pastor, I worked at Plymouth Church for a while in Lawrence, and my title there was the Pastor of Care and Welcome. It's sort of like, it's the cozy lit title for a pastor, the Pastor of Care and Welcome. But one of the things I did was when we had visitors, and college towns have lots of visitors coming in. I would host a meeting for the visitors to meet each other. It's a place where they could ask questions about the church, to tell their story of faith. And I would always ask them to tell me about their faith journey and what brought them to Plymouth Church. And again, if you don't know, Plymouth is the United Church of Christ in Lawrence. I began to see some patterns in these stories. Some people were there because they'd found God's abiding love in a church very similar. Maybe they'd moved to Lawrence, they'd been a member of a Presbyterian church or a Lutheran church that had an organ, and they liked the hymns, and it was an open congregation, and this place felt like home. But others were coming because they yearned to abide in God's love. Many of them had tried, or maybe even thought at one point they were abiding in God's love, but then something happened that made them feel undeserving or even exiled from God's love. Maybe they had a gay child who was no longer accepted in their community or friends, and they just couldn't stay any longer in that place that wouldn't welcome their loved ones, their beloved children. Others were part of the LGBTQ plus community, people who'd grown up in church. They knew their Bible, they'd studied, they'd went every Sunday with their families and maybe even Wednesdays. But at some point in their life, they knew who they were, and they heard the message that there was something deeply wrong with them. They were not deserving of God's love. They would not or could not be invited to abide in God's love. I will tell you, listening to these stories over and over again, this is a terrible, hurtful message for people to hear. And it was this message, not God's love, that had set up an abiding home in their hearts. The stories it should break your heart. And even though they were visiting the United Church of Christ because they'd heard that it was an open church or people had told them it was an open church, they still didn't quite believe. They were very tenuous coming in the door. They were tenuous that the church was preaching, that they really believed what they were preaching. They were tenuous that they could become full members of the church, that the families that they had or hoped to have someday or were building would not only be accepted but celebrated. Some of them had been to other churches that said they would be accepted, that had said, come on in, but it turned out not to be true. And they found out many months later. This, I tell you, was just as hurtful as the churches that were upfront about how unwelcoming they would be. I've always thought of the folks that carrying these messages inside of themselves, and yet they showed up at churches. They're so brave. It was such a courageous thing to do, to come. But they had this yearning inside of them, a yearning to get back to a place where they felt that abiding love, or to a place they'd never been. They wanted that abiding relationship of love that would bring joy that the Gospel of John tells us about. So the author, the children's book that I read this morning, there's an author's note in the book, in the back of the book. And she tells much the same story of what I experienced working as the pastor of care and welcome. She wrote this: years ago, a friend encouraged me to attend a service at her church. I was very, she puts in all caps, very reluctant. I was raised in a church that wasn't at all accepting of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Later, as an adult in the LGBT community, I'd been to churches where I didn't feel welcomed. Many churches still preach the idea that being lesbian, gay, bisexual, and/or transgender is wrong, and as a result, many LGBT people feel as if there's no place for them in any church. But my friend, who is a lesbian, said her church was different. "You'll love it," she said. "It's a rock your world experience." And it did, in fact, rock my world. For the first time, I had found a spiritual community that fully accepted and embraced LGBT people. In writing this book, I wanted to capture that feeling. I'm grateful to all the spiritual communities throughout the world, from every denomination, that welcome, accept, embrace, and celebrate us for who we are. End quote. Colonial Church. As an open and affirming congregation, we are being called to be a church that rocks the world. We are called to become bold witnesses for LGBTQ plus justice and inclusion, ensuring that all people are celebrated as beloved children of God. We are called to offer a different, cozy even, enduring message, to be a place where the voice of God that came to me, I believe 100% came to me as a young teenager in the pews of a Catholic church, telling me that God's love was for all, that this message can be heard and should be heard by all people. To be a place where people know without question that their children will be loved and embraced whoever they are growing up and becoming. Where that deep hurt that is so often lodged and seemingly abiding in hearts that hurts, that can be healed. Where Jesus, who wants nothing more than to abide with us, has the space and welcome to do so. That is the church we should be, and I believe we are. So let us celebrate that this month and also keep becoming. Amen.